Greetings to everyone who is joining us online for our conversation today on climate resilience and what more do we need to do collectively as scientists, as innovators, as investors, as leaders in business and communities to work with policymakers to both secure natural ecosystems while also sustaining people's lives and livelihoods. My name is Jane Nelson from Harvard Kennedy School, and it is my great pleasure to welcome our fantastic guests who are with us today. Dr. Martha Munoz, who is a professor in ecology and evolutionary biology at Yale University, and the recipient of the prestigious 2024 MacArthur Prize for her pioneering work in her field. Jairo Trad, who is the co-founder and chief executive officer of an innovative climate tech company, Kilimo, which works with farmers and large companies to optimize water use in agriculture while also improving farmer lives and livelihoods. And Andre Hoffman, who is vice chair of Roche Holdings, one of the world's leading pharmaceutical companies. He is currently a co-chair of the World Economic Forum and a mentor to many of us in the field of corporate sustainability and philanthropy. Thank you all for being with us. And as we all know, the planet we're facing intensifying both environmental, socioeconomic, and political challenges. And the escalation of extreme weather events and environmental degradation is already negatively impacting the lives and the livelihoods of some 3.2 billion people around the world. And we know what the challenges are, and I think the leadership challenge is also increasingly clear and compelling. First of all, how do we do a better job at both listening to but also communicating what respected scientists from different disciplines are telling us about the state of our planet and the state of people's lives? Secondly, how do we do a better job of taking that information, both the sort of scientific data, the scientific evidence, and integrating it into decision-making of policymakers, of business leaders, of investors, of innovators, of entrepreneurs? And thirdly, how do we do a better job of operating across both disciplinary boundaries but also cross-sector boundaries to scale the type of solutions that I think we're beginning to develop when it comes to simultaneously securing natural ecosystems while improving people's lives and livelihoods? And so although the challenge is clear and compelling, it's also very difficult and complex, but it's urgent, and I think it's getting more urgent every day. And so that's sort of some of the themes we want to pick out in the conversation today. We're going to start our conversation with a pre-recorded presentation from Dr. Munoz, sharing just a small insight into her research on different pathways of adaptation and some of the potential but also challenges of building resilience to extreme weather events and environmental degradation. And then we'll go from that into a conversation. So over to Dr. Munoz's presentation.
Life is spectacularly diverse. Think of all the organisms that teem on coral reefs or in tropical jungles. Consider all of nature's fruits upon which we rely for medicine, health, agriculture, and engineering. While living things are so overwhelmingly different, they are connected by a common thread. All of life is the product of evolution, beginning with the first organisms that emerged billions of years ago to those that live today and into the future in which our existence is uncertain. Ever since Darwin's pioneering work in the mid-19th century, we know that natural selection is the primary mechanism by which evolution occurs. Think of it this way. Natural selection occurs when survivorship and reproduction are non-random, with some individuals faring better than others. Over time, this differential success produces evolutionary change. Over enough time, new species can form. Through many years of careful study, scientists have observed the incredibly powerful force that natural selection can exert on organisms. In a famous example, we know that when a devastating drought hit the Galapagos, the resident finches experienced a particularly brutal bout of natural selection. Most birds died, and the few survivors were those with the largest beaks, which allowed them to crack open the very few remaining seeds. And so it goes in nature. Droughts hit, hurricanes hit, selection happens and evolution follows. This perspective emphasizes that natural selection is something that happens to organisms. But there is more complexity to this story. Organisms are not passive vessels exclusively at selection's whim and mercy. Through their behavior, organisms have agency over the selection they experience. When organisms behaviorally buffer themselves from environmental extremes, they dampen the natural selection that they experience, which in turn limit or slow down evolution. I've spent my career exploring the many ways that organisms use behavior to influence evolutionary outcomes, with a particular focus on tropical lizards. My team and I have made some unexpected discoveries about how these lizards and other animals are responding to one of the most pressing current selective pressures, which is climate change, specifically rising environmental temperatures. Now, my fascination with the role of behavior in evolution began about 2 decades ago in the Dominican Republic on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola. Now, near sea level, it's as warm and balmy as you might expect of the Caribbean, but as you go up in the mountains, it gets really cold. So cold, you might think that you're here in New York City rather than in the tropics. Despite the chilly environment, there are lizards on these summits. I was really curious about this. How did these tropical lizards find themselves on cold mountaintops? I spent many years carefully studying these lizards and made a startling discovery. These lizards were not physiologically adapted to life at high elevation. In fact, in most regards, these lizards hadn't changed their biology at all with respect to their lowland relatives. How could they live in a cold habitat despite still being adapted to life in warm environments? It turns out that they were using behavior to recreate the warm, low-elevation habitats to which they were already well adapted. These lizards were incredibly picky about where and when they chose to be active, using the warmest times of day to budget their activities. They may not have been living at sea level, but they made the mountaintops feel like sea level through their behavior. These behaviors also impacted the lizard's evolution. By shielding themselves from natural selection, the physiology of these lizards evolves very slowly. This insight broadens the story on natural selection. Certainly, natural selection still has the power to affect organisms, but organisms also have the power to affect natural selection. Organisms are not entirely at the mercy of their environments. Now, what does this mean for lizards in a warming world? We've spent the past several years exploring how these lizards and others from the Caribbean have been responding to rising temperatures, and we've made some interesting discoveries. Lizards that are good at using behavior to their advantage typically live on forest edges, where there's abundant sun and shade. They shuttle between different patches, which allows them to maintain a stable body temperature, even when the environment fluctuates. As a result of these buffering behaviors, these thermoregulating lizards have not evolved a more heat-tolerant physiology. Keep in mind, however, that this is not an inexhaustible strategy. Without sun and shade patches, these lizards cannot avoid experiencing warming-driven selection. In places where forests are cut down to make way for cattle pasture, for example, the lizards have evanesced. But we also know that not all lizards have the behavioral agency to buffer against the heat. Lizards from cloud forests and rainforests are really poor thermoregulators. In those species, lizard body temperatures track the environment. When the environment warms up, so do the lizards. So they can't use behavior to their advantage. Instead, these lizards should experience the full brunt of natural selection. And that's exactly what we've observed. Over the past decade, their heat tolerance has increased by about 2 degrees Celsius. This is an incredible amount of physiological change in a really short window. This also is not an inexhaustible strategy. These heat tolerances are now hitting the upper ceiling of what we know to even be possible in these lizards, and it's unclear how much farther they can go. If the source of selection, that is rising temperatures, doesn't abate, then the extinction risk rises. And they're intimately tied to those closed canopy forests. If we lose the forest, we lose the species. Cloud forests and rainforests are hotspots of species richness, so a lot of biodiversity is at risk. In the context of global change, these findings are eye-opening. As temperatures rise, behavioral and physiological adjustment are two of the primary weapons that organisms have in their arsenal to contend with the challenge. But we find that these two weapons cannot be deployed simultaneously. In fact, the factors that make behavioral buffering more likely also make physiological adaptation less likely, and vice versa. The arsenal that these lizards and other animals can marshal to their defense is effectively cut in half. These discoveries I've shared do not just apply to lizards, they apply to all animals. Behavioral buffering presents an immediate line of defense, and organisms do capitalize on that agency when they can. Behavioral buffering isn't equally accessible to all animals. Corals, for example, cannot move. When their capacity to physiologically adjust is exceeded, they bleach and die. And this message applies to us as well. We are all subject to global change and its many consequences, not just our generation, but also the ones that will inherit our decisions, both the beneficial and harmful ones. We are already experiencing the health, food, and economic costs of rising temperatures. We are losing biodiversity and all the innovations for human health and society that they may harbor. In many ways, we are no different than these Caribbean lizards and other organisms on Earth. Our access to resources, health, and well-being are all on the line. Most people on this planet are faced with constraints that limit their individual agency over this global, multidimensional challenge. Some of us, however, have greater power and agency to change circumstances, to improve the landscape for all. We're here to discuss how decisions made in the present will impact the future. I encourage us to reflect on those choices, the agency we choose to enact, and how those will determine resilience, vulnerability, or loss.
Thank you, Martha, both for that really insightful presentation and the incredibly important work that you and your colleagues are doing. And of the many themes I could take out of that, I'd like to sort of focus on this concept of adaptive agency, and from sort of lizards and corals to human beings and communities. What do we need to strengthen that adaptive agency and make sure that more people have access to it?
Oh, well, thank you so much for your kind words, and that's a really great question. I think when discussing agency, what the lizards and other organisms have taught us, I would say, boils down to two main things. The first is that agency requires infrastructure. In the case of the lizards, that requires a habitat that facilitates the use of behavioral agency, and not all lizards have that access, right? So infrastructure and the ability to use agency, and whether and how it is doled across different factions of society, different organisms, different ecosystems, is a topic for consideration. The second is that even when agency is used, there are trade-offs at play, and that it's never a cost-free enterprise. Whenever a behavioral decision is made to divert resources in one dimension, it means that it won't be diverted in another. So the use of agency will always require careful thought.
And trade-offs and understanding of power dynamics.
Correct.
As well, I would imagine.
That's right.
And when you're talking about infrastructure, that would be natural infrastructure, physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, all different types of infrastructure when we're looking at the role of us as humans and communities.
Economic infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, and that would, probably a good segue to you, Hira, because you're working with hundreds of thousands of farmers in a number of countries, actually helping to build that infrastructure and new models of partnership so that they can be more adaptive and resilient. So, what insights would you have on this question of infrastructure?
So, we started Kilimo a couple of years ago. We developed a software solution that uses AI to help farmers make better irrigation decisions.
Yeah.
But at some point, we stumbled with the blocker that for agriculture, water is essentially free. So, being a tool that optimizes a free resource is not that valuable. Yeah?
So that's a type of trade-off that Mark is talking about. Yeah.
And at that point, we understood that we decided, as a small company from the middle of nowhere, to take the task upon us to work on reshaping the value of water in food production. Yeah? And to do that, we needed powerful allies. So we started talking with people, going to a meeting, another meeting, and at some point, when we discovered that many companies had a strong knowledge of water risk. They knew that in specific areas where they have operation, they had significant and meaningful risk. Yeah? And they didn't have enough infrastructure to invest outside of the fence to help the overall watersheds to be healthy, right? So we developed this model where we connect these companies that want to invest in water security, sometimes for environmental responsibility, but many, many times for a pure risk management strategy, focused purely on the business continuity. We connect these companies with farmers that can save water in the same watershed where they have operation. So far, we have a partnership with multiple Fortune 100 companies that are working with us to help the farmers in the watershed be more efficient with the water they save. And by doing that, those farmers are getting paid, and we provide those incentives. So we're building this economic infrastructure in a way that rewards behavior and reinforces that behavior at the farmer level by partnership with a very unlikely ally. Yeah.
And at the same time, that's not only incentivizing both better water use, but broader biodiversity management, ecosystem management, I assume, and also giving farmers livelihoods because they're becoming part of value chains.
So the interventions we do are either providing a software tool, but we also finance physical infrastructure. We install irrigation equipment on the farmer level, and we finance regenerative agriculture interventions. So these farmers have better infrastructure, better access to technology, and better soils. So that's only happening because us and a lot of people in the space has managed to build this model where companies can account and acknowledge how their water impacts are there, how much money they have at risk, and how they can start putting resources on managing those risks.
Absolutely. And picking up on that question of trade-offs, because if you're a smallholder farmer, you're not going to be preserving the water if there's not the incentive there.
Yeah.
And so looking at those trade-offs and providing not only the information and the technology, but the incentives that can help the farmers make more informed decisions.
With the problem as old and as water and agriculture, it's never a technology problem. Yeah, the problem there is always what are the incentives we're putting there and what's the framework we're putting those farmers to make decisions for tomorrow and for the next 50, 100 years.
No, exactly, and I think that's a good segue to you, Andre, in terms of incentives and larger corporations, investors that have either been here for 100 years or hope to be here for a future 100 years. Harry's given us the example of agribusiness companies linking with smallholder farmers and helping to build both resilience and adaptation economically as well as environmentally. I mean, where do you see some of the best practices in terms of large corporations and investors really integrating some of these themes of resilience, adaptation, nature positive, and building the internal infrastructure as well as sort of the value chain infrastructure to embed these into corporate decision making and investor decision making?
Well, thank you very much for the question. When you look at resilience and infrastructure, we tend to look at farmers. We tend to look at ways of producing goods with nature. Now, if we really want to make sure that in the long term nature is something that continues to underpin everything we do on the planet, we're going to have to go over and above this sort of management or even this sort of optimization. We're going to have to take nature as a stock, as the basis of what we are doing. And so I have a tendency of, when I talk to my colleagues, to talk to them about biodiversity as life. Life is not anything else than the ultimate resources we deal on. So adaptation, evolution, management of resources, it all boils down to the same thing. If you continue to, in a logic of extraction and pollution, at some stage life disappears. And of course, I don't have to finish that sentence. It has immediate impact on all of us. So good examples would be when you put nature onto the balance sheet and when you make an investment decision, whatever the investment is, you need to be able to realize that it has an impact on the nature stock. And if this nature stock is mismanaged, well, if you misbehave, let's say, then you get to a point where the continuing of adding value in that process eventually hits a wall. And we're not very far away from that. So good examples are a bit difficult to find.
Yeah. And what role do you think boards of directors have to play in that process, and and coming back to setting those incentives within companies. Where do you?
I think in big companies there are always a sort of two trends. There are the people who govern the institution for the long term. You were talking about the first 100 years. In our case, in our family, 128 years. How are we going to make sure that those 128 years appear? So you think in that time horizon. But for the majority of management, what I would call, without any intention of negativeness, the middle management, what counts is the budget. You need to deliver. If you don't deliver, you're no longer part of the conversation. If the company becomes unprofitable, then you're a problem, and nobody wants a problem. So if you really want to use business as a source for good, you need to make sure that you create this value on the long term. And that's not just a conversation you have in front of the camera. That's something that really has to happen every day in the field. And it's very important that this value of preservation, and I must say even restoration, is something that drives us. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to continue the system as it exists. The current status quo is not working.
Absolutely, and I think building on that, your framing of nature as life, and it's preservation, it's restoration, it's regeneration, nature positive. There's the science and there's the data that I think we're increasingly aware of, but need to be more aware of. There's the incentives and the infrastructure, but there's also the inspiration, the mobilization of citizens, of managers, of young people, of investors, of innovators, of farmers. And it seems one of the challenges we have is making that link between all the research that you and your colleagues and many other brilliant scientists are doing around the world, and the evidence that you are finding and demonstrating. How do we make that link, and from a communication perspective, to inspire and mobilize not just decision makers, but as you say, sort of everyone at every level of a company, farmers, communities, citizens. And Martha, maybe back to you. I mean, what more could we be doing to communicate the science better, and to change behaviors?
Well, that's a big question and a really important one. I think we are, as scientists, storytellers. We tell the story of nature. Yeah. And I read a lot of literature and poetry. The difference is this story is true. It's the story of us and our place in the world. So I think we all have a natural curiosity for the natural world and for our place in it. I can tell you that that's why I got into this field. I didn't make these discoveries that I shared with you intentionally or with the purpose of making those discoveries. They came from the natural course of the work of studying the organisms that began with a fascination and a curiosity for nature and just putting one foot in front of the other. So I think that message, that basic curiosity that motivates life scientists, but scientists in general, is lost a little bit. And that connection to what we're trying to preserve gets lost a little bit. I can tell you that organisms are far more dimensional than their extinction risk.
Very good point. Interesting, yeah.
So when we think, for example, of the icons of conservation, we can think of, for example, the panda. Yeah. And a lot of really important work that has gone into conserving the panda, and for good reason. But when you ask anyone what they know about the panda, they're very likely to tell you that it eats bamboo and it's at high risk of extinction. There's so much more to the panda's story, to its evolution, its ecology, its behavior and biology. We can do better as stewards of the stories of organisms at telling the dimensionality, the totality, giving more holistic perspectives on organisms. I think that connects people better to nature and inspires us and reminds us that we're conserving part of our story too and how those organisms fit into it.
That's a wonderful, yeah.
To that, of course, the panda is known, it's studied, it's been a subject for a long time, but there's so much more of the natural world that we don't even know about. I always take the example of a wetland. We know what's flying, we know what's in the water, we know what's at the interface, but as soon as you go deep into the mud, it's terra incognita. There are thousands of bacteria that we will probably never even know. And we need to tell stories about that as well. You know, life sometimes is smelly and muddy, and it's not only about nice pandas.
Yeah,
I agree.
I would like to chip in there because connecting two dots between long-term and storytelling, I think that we have to make a conscious effort of working around long-term storytelling because, especially in the climate scene and the nature scene, fear is an amazing short-term tool. We can get a lot of money delivered to pandas by talking that they're going to go extinct tomorrow. Yeah, first, nature doesn't work that way. Nothing is going to happen tomorrow in 2 seconds. Things have a long term, and we don't know all the long-term implications of things happening. Second, it has been proven by science that it's not the best way to do things. Fear brings short-term action, but a long-term reaction that ends up in very, very, very dark spaces.
And one-dimensional thinking.
That's one dimension. I think that it's key that we bring this long-term story that are positive, that talk about consensus, how we're here because we agree on things, that talk about doing this small thing is going to bring to another small thing that's going to bring to an extra big thing. So I think that finding this way of bringing a new climate storytelling that is positive and moving forward, and it's not focusing getting a lot of money tomorrow or in action, but getting the biggest amount of humans agreeing that this is a big issue that we need to act on.
No, absolutely. And I mean, and how are you doing it at a community level? I mean, sort of community storytelling, and again, you know, just the incredible power of indigenous knowledge and oral histories and oral storytelling, you know, community consensus building. How are you, and also linking the stories of smallholder farmers to large companies? I mean, what?
For us, it's always very important. We try to be very respectful of everybody's story. So I come from a small town of 700 people. So it's a very small town in the middle of nowhere in Argentina, literally. And there you get to learn that, for example, some common idea is that the farmer is this poor person that is covered in dirt. They're probably covered in dirt, but that's because they're working and creating food for all of us. Yeah, so they're there. So putting and what we always try to do in these and many stages is to put a real perspective on who are the stakeholders and what the value they bring to the table, and especially for the people in position of power, not to treat them as a sort of like object that is put in a box and only that box. Yeah. So for us, is bringing as much positive and broader story about the panda, about the farmers. In our case, that's what we do.
About the mud.
And bringing that to light is extremely important because first, acts the complexity that we need to manage in the scenario, but also make you understand that the thing that is on the other side of the table is living and with multiple dimensions.
Yeah. And Andre, coming to you on this concept of storytelling, in some ways, as you know, Jairo was sort of talking about sort of stakeholders and telling, you know, more holistic stories about all the species, including ourselves, telling collective stories at a community level. What's the corporate equivalent? I mean, you've been a real proponent of the stakeholder capitalism model, and you know, companies in an evidence-based way, telling that more holistic story about who they are, corporate purpose, impacts both on nature as well as on other stakeholders. Where do you see corporate storytelling has to go to promote resilience and adaptation?
I think that in humanity in general, we rather like entertaining some myths, and then there's this idea that professionalism is actually making money. That's what it is. Yeah. Well, looking after the common good is not necessarily linked to short-term profit maximization. Maybe there is an intermediary between the two. And if you want to really tell the stories of business as a force for good, and I really do believe that business is a force for good, if you want to be able to do that, you need to be able to tie the costs with the benefit for society as a whole. So corporations, you were talking about stakeholders, corporations are not run for shareholders only, they run for society, for the positive contribution to society. Now obviously it has to be profitable. If it's not profitable, as we said before, it's a problem. And if it's a problem, that's not something, it cannot be part of the solution. So we need to be able to introduce in this notion the fact that in this notion of profitability, that profit at all costs is dangerous for the system. And if it's dangerous for the system, it's dangerous for the company. So there we are again with this idea of biodiversity and life. If we continue to destroy the planet to be able to make a living, but there's a contradiction there, a big knot that we tie in the middle. So the narrative is an easy one. It's to say, well, we are not doing this just to satisfy us, me, but we need to do it for us. Yeah, we must go from the me to the we. And society understands that something like this is indispensable. It's just we don't really have the right images to bring it forward. Because that idea we need to really sort of impregnate in people. It's not just when I say in people, it sounds a bit like if I knew better than them, which I don't, of course. You know, humanity has to realize that value created at the cost of one of the what I would call the three capitals, the social, the human, and the natural. If you injure one of the three capitals to get to produce capital, well, you're not sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. And philanthropists and foundations, you know, do you think they could be doing more to invest in scientific research centres, in biodiverse rich areas, to lift up storytelling about the wholeness of us as part of nature, not separate from nature?
Well, I also read quite a lot of books, and it's not poetry or not novels. It's more science fiction. I like science fiction because science fiction brings us, it gives us sort of an idea of what. I mean, the big themes of science fiction we all had. Huh? We had the pandemic, the nuclear winter, which we've never been as close to. When the machine takes over, it will destroy humanity. I mean, all these big themes we have since a long time. But the one that I think dominates the most is the one that the single individual is always better than the system, and that's just not true. That's a lie. We've been lied to for many years, so we need to do something about that. I'm sorry, I don't remember the question.
No, but it's a really important point you're making, that that thinking of ourselves as an individual who's part of a community, whether it's a local community, a company community, a scientific community, and then that collective communities together that are part of this broader system. So that sort of systems leadership, systems thinking, which we probably don't teach enough in our schools, or let alone our universities, and so thinking more in a systemic way, I think, is important.
If you come back to the evolution conversation we had at the beginning, evolution is under hardship, and I think that if you want to create a stable society, we need to minimize hardship. We need to be happy. We need to be able to do things which corresponds to our values. We need to be able to self-realize into our daily lives. Otherwise, we're going to evolve into something not very attractive, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And then the sort of question I was sort of aiming to get at also was the role of philanthropy, because I know the World Economic Forum is now bringing philanthropists much more into this conversation of helping to support the system, whether it is scientific research or community empowerment, addressing some of the storytelling challenges that we face, and opportunities.
I mean, obviously philanthropy does a lot of good, and we invest in the right thing. We help the research, we help the agriculture in certain places, but really there is something basically flawed in this, because this is the concept of giving back. Now, I mean, if you give back, it implies you have taken.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, I haven't taken. I have, with somebody else, created something which helps the patient. Our pharmaceutical business does not employ people because they're profitable. It employs people because they allow us to bring solution to unmet medical need. And so for me, this idea of co-creation of value is much more important than giving back. It's the story of James Bond. James Bond kills, but he kills for the king, so it's okay. He kills. He still kills, And so the idea of making profit at all costs, because after that we give back to society, for me that's a basic flaw of the system. No, I don't want philanthropists who are listening to stop giving, and please continue to give. It's a good idea. It's a pool of money that you can actually use for something. But believing that it justifies it's not how you spend the money that matters. It's how you make it.
How you make it, absolutely.
And that's so important. If you don't get that thing through, So that's my view of philanthropy. Sorry.
No, and I think that's a very, very strong message of not how you spend the money or allocate the money afterwards, but how you make it, as well as how it gets allocated. And I want to pick up on that theme of co-creation and sort of co-problem solving. And Martha, come back to you, and that you're obviously an esteemed scientist. You're based at Yale, but you do a lot of work in the field, on the ground, with local communities, local partners. How are you co-creating in a way that, as Jairo mentioned, sort of recognizes power dynamics, recognizes that not everyone has the same access to infrastructure, to information? What are you doing to not just build partnerships, but to co-create solutions and enable your research?
Oh, that's a great question. I do these collaborations in the name of science. So the purpose of the work that I do is to understand the organisms better, hopefully ultimately to conserve them better. I engage in institutional partnerships. This means that, you know, for example, in the Dominican Republic, I've been working there more than a decade and a half. I've established relationships with people in the government, in museums, in universities. People who are in my lab, you know, formerly worked for the government in species conservation in the Dominican Republic. So the idea that science can occur in this spatial vacuum is generally untrue. And I would argue that the quality of the work we've been able to do and the impact of that work has been broadened because we've made strong partnerships with non-academic entities. And in my experience, the total is always greater than the sum of the parts. So yeah, we've benefited a lot and grown a lot through these collaborations.
And as sort of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, how do you sort of incorporate that?
Local naturalists, people who, I mean, we are naturally curious about the world around us, and the places where I do research is no different. I have learned so much about the organisms by talking to like-minded nerds, people who like to go out, study the organisms, explore where they live, and they, you know, those individuals have become collaborators, true collaborators in the research. There isn't a project that I've done that hasn't benefited or required or grown because I've worked with people who know more about the organisms than I could ever hope to. Yeah. Spent a lot of
grounded there,
yes,
and live there, and that
yes,
again, nature is life, and it's their lives.
Of course. Yeah. So I can spend a few weeks, you know, in the company of lizards, which I happily do, but others spend their whole lives in the company of these organisms, right? And know more than I could ever hope to gain. So those partnerships are very important to the work.
And that combination of that sort of curiosity with you know, deep-seated respect and humility wherever we're engaging and wherever we're working.
Yes, and meet people where they are, and you know, don't helicopter in and out. Truly collaborate.
Yeah.
Those have turned into friendships and partnerships and long-term collaborations. You know, I see as all as this part of the same ecosystem. And equal stakeholders.
And that's where the government funding, corporate philanthropic funding is important. Coming back to your point, Harry, that you know, it takes time to build the trust, to build the relationships, to do the type of research that you're doing, to, you know, and you know, for ecosystems, you know, both natural and our sort of human ecosystems to continue to adapt and co-create and evolve. And so being able to, you know, demonstrate sort of some short-term progress, but also invest in the long term, and those relationships that do take time to build, you know, over longer periods is crucial. And Haro, as we sort of start to sort of close up, you know, back to you on this idea of co-creation, you know, which and in some ways is, you know, an even more powerful term to me than partnership, and that it's, you know, what are you actually trying to achieve by coming together?
My idea of, so connecting two amazing dots here, so my idea of a true partnership is a partnership that feels stupid. I mean, why are these people collaborating? It truly doesn't make sense. Because we think that there's so much value to be unlocked there. So something that happens all the time when we say, so a tech company is paying us so we can pay farmers so they are more efficient. People say, what? How that makes sense? And then we explain the business case. The tech company is being egoistic. Yeah, they want to preserve the water for the long term because they want to be there for the long term. Yeah, we are a company. We're thinking ourselves. I mean, we want to create a business that creates value. And farmers are being egoistic. If they get the right incentives, they're gonna certainly do the right things, right? So, and by doing that, we create this type of unique models where everybody wins, but winning for themselves. But we were there organizing and helping that thing happen. So we think that acknowledging that creating systemic change means that you have to go with the idea that everybody is rooting from themselves. And that's fine. Evolution happens only because everybody is trying to survive. Yeah? And then trying to bring the right stakeholders to the table so that circle of value gets created, and that not only spills for the stakeholders there, but then in the areas where we have operation, there is more water available for the community. Yeah? And also our farmers can produce more food. So there are many other stakeholders that get benefit from that circle of value between partnership that will never be at the same table ever. Is very valuable, and that's what we look for.
Yeah, interesting. And it's both you try to create that sort of circle of value, but also respect. And going back to one of Martha's opening comments, of trade-offs do have to be made, and so if you've got that trust and respect, it's easier to to address some of those difficult decisions and questions. Well, I'm conscious we are very quickly running out of time here, and with COP30 coming up and the World Social Summit coming up, what would be your sort of closing call to action for leaders in your community in terms of what's needed to take a more systemic approach and achieve scale in co-creating solutions, both for natural ecosystems as well as people? And maybe again we can start with you, Martha, in terms of a call to action.
Well, that's an important thing to consider. I will not do a call to action that I wouldn't also hold myself accountable for. So this is as much a call to myself as to my peers. I think the organisms can't speak for themselves, right? And so we are the ones who can tell the stories of nature. And it's very easy, I'm as guilty of this as any, to do that within our community, to do that to our peers at scientific conferences, but it needs to be broader than that. We need to make the effort to speak across disciplines and tell the story of nature in a way that is accessible to everyone across disciplines. Because as I said before, partnership will always be greater than the sum of the parts. I consider myself one of those parts, and I know that by sharing these stories with other individuals with different skill sets and capacities, we can scale better. So I would say to continue, I know many scientists do that, to continue doing that and think about new ways in which we could do that.
And potentially harnessing some of the potential of social media and sort of very creative ways of storytelling and and connecting. And I like both the sort of multidisciplinary approach within scholarship and the academy, but also that cross-sector approach, which obviously Hari, you lead on. So what would your call to action from a PMO perspective?
Water is the final boss of collective action. It's a huge problem that when you get into the space, you're not gonna solve it alone. So I think this has been said many times, but I think it's especially needed at this moment. Please don't give up on collaboration. Yeah, we need to keep collaborating. We have many big challenges as humanity into the future, and right now it feels like we should give up in collaboration. And many people are saying let's give up on collective work and big forums like this one, but please don't. Yeah, we need to keep collaborating.
No, absolutely. And yet, we need the storytelling on the collaboration as well, don't we? Because your story of specific farmers in a specific place and specific communities working with specific companies on specific solutions that are holistic and systemic is far more inspiring than a very. We need the broad policy calls and the global coalitions, but it's that storytelling around what collaboration looks like that is also important. No, thank you. Andre, call to action.
I really like this emphasis on collaboration. I mean, collaboration will always be better than domination, and we tried domination for such a long time in the history, and it has not yielded anything. Yeah. Now, I think if there is a call of action, it would be to sort of look ourselves in the mirror and to be absolutely frank about ourselves. We are in a dangerous situation. The status quo is driving us to the precipice. Most of the people know that, and yet we do very little about that. Now, when you are doing something that you don't believe in, there is a name for that. It's schizophrenia. It's a split personality, and it's a pathology. And if you're ill, you should go and see a doctor. And now one of the things you should really do is to accept the fact that our current behavior needs to change. Now, how do you change a system? Because that's what we're talking about. I think you need to start at the own personal level. So for each individual, try to identify your frustration, your schizophrenia, and deal with it. It doesn't have to be saving the panda, to come back to the example. It doesn't have to be saving the Amazon. It can be just being a happy person. We will not improve the system, we will not change the system with unhappy people. people. So let's deal with all this. Let's help the old lady to cross the street. Let's make a gesture of kindness to our neighbor. Let's participate to the collective good, and then we will have a chance to do something about the system. But to a certain extent, the common good is based on happiness, and that's what we need to work on.
Yeah, happiness and respect. And I think that's a wonderful way to finish. I think 3 key takeaways from this very rich conversation, and thank you all so much for being with us today. One is, nature is life, our lives as well as the lives of all the species, and for many of the species we're at the precipice, and there is an urgency here that we have to address, but we have to address it in a way that brings in creativity, curiosity, co-creation, problem-solving approaches, and a more systemic approach. But we cannot separate ourselves as the human species from both the risks but also the incredible opportunities of being part of the broader natural system. Secondly, this key point about taking a systemic approach, understanding, whether it's at a local community, at a global level, within your sort of research domain, who are the key stakeholders? How do we both get the key stakeholders around the table, recognize the power dynamics, and through genuine respect and consultation, understand the system, understand the infrastructure, opportunities, constraints, the incentives, so that we can make that sort of collective decision-making work. But then I think that final point that all of our leadership responsibilities as individuals, and curiosity, kindness, seeing ourselves as something larger than ourselves, as someone who engages a lot with students and young people. How do we absolutely communicate the sense of urgency, because we do face major challenges as a global community, at local communities, but also that sense of possibility of what can be achieved both for ourselves and the broader natural system that we're part of. So thank you, all of you, very much for being with us. Thank you to the World Economic Forum for bringing us together and continuing to try to build those partnerships across disciplines and across sectors to find shared solutions. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.